South Mountain State Park covers more than 20,000 acres and contains many miles of trails, including equestrian ones. However, the primary attraction of the park is High Shoals Falls, which is an 80-foot tall waterfall. This video covers High Shoals Falls Loop Trail, which is the primary trail that takes you by the falls. This trail is 2.4 miles long, but is only about 0.9 miles to High Shoals Falls. So if you prefer, you can just hike up to the falls and then turn back around to go down. The trail starts out easy, but it gets pretty strenuous, especially in the last tenth of a mile before reaching the falls. That section contains quite a few steps. There's still plenty of other cool spots and reasons to visit, even if you do not want to hike all the way up to the main falls. The trail is pretty heavily trafficked, especially on weekends. South Mountain State Park is located in Connolly Springs, North Carolina, about 14 miles south of Interstate 40 near Morganton. To get to the entrance, you'll turn from Ward Gap Road onto South Mountain Park Road. There are several other trailheads and parking lots on this road, but you'll need to continue all the way to the end of the road to get to the parking lot for High Shoals Falls Loop Trail. You may also want to stop at the Visitor Center, which you will see on your right. The Visitor Center contains a store as well as restrooms. The restrooms should be accessible from the outside entrances, even if the rest of the Visitor Center is closed. There are also good restrooms at the trailhead. There are plenty of great things for kids to do, even if you decide not to hike all the way up to High Shoals Falls. There are several good spots right near the parking lot where they can play in the water. This area also contains many picnic tables as well as the good restrooms that I mentioned earlier. Some smaller kids may struggle a bit with the steps up to the main falls, but there are several cool spots that all kids should be able to handle the hike to, including a small waterfall which I will talk about in my trail walkthrough. Most dogs should be able to handle the hike up to the falls, but you may need to carry some smaller dogs when you reach the steps. There's also one particular long, narrow bridge where some dogs may have to be carefully restrained to keep them from bothering other passing hikers. Of course, as I mentioned, there are plenty of spots for dogs to play in the water as well. But there are no water crossings in the trail, so it will not be a problem for dogs who happen to not like water. Dogs are required to be on leashes. This trail is mostly good for photographers, but there are a couple of problems you may run into. The first problem is a very common one that I ran into on this particular day, and that is dramatic differences in lighting. The pretty cool looking platform at the base of the falls, as well as the lower portion of the falls, are often very shaded, whereas on sunny days the top of the falls can be very bright. This makes getting a good photo significantly more challenging. This problem is of course alleviated on a cloudier day. The other major problem is the narrow bridge I mentioned, which crosses the river at one of the best spots where the water is flowing through several large rocks. The bridge is so narrow that stopping on it is awkward, especially at a busy time, as you will have people squeezing by you, and setting up a tripod for long exposures is virtually impossible. I did manage to get this one long exposure photo by attaching a mini tripod to the rail. It turned out pretty good despite the rail being very shaky. The parking lot for High Shoals Falls is a pretty good size, but it can definitely fill up on busier days. If you're going on a weekend, I recommend trying to get there by around 9 o'clock. If you come later, you may end up being stopped at the entrance by park workers until spaces become available. There are a few trails that take off from the parking lot. The main trail that takes off from the middle of the parking lot and the trail down the hill that takes off to the right of the bridge both lead to the same place. The trail that crosses the bridge can still lead you to the falls, but it is much longer. I have never gone that way, but according to the map you would just need to keep to the right at every split in order to get to the top of the falls. Of the other two trails, the one you decide to start on is not very important, as they just parallel each other for probably less than a tenth of a mile before joining together. I prefer the lower one because it stays by the river and has one little overlook spot toward the end. This lower trail is also the area that I mentioned that is great for kids to play in the water. There are also several benches along the trail which can be good for adults who may not want to get in the water with the kids. The restrooms are, however, on the upper trail, which can also be accessed from the large picnic area that is between the two trails. The two trails also both connect to the amphitheater that is in the middle. I do not know how often the amphitheater is used. I believe it is mostly for camps. The lower trail comes up the hill and joins with the upper trail, which is really just a gravel road that cars don't normally drive on. You'll continue down this road for a little longer before reaching the first split. The trail that splits off to the right is fairly new. This is the trail that leads to the other waterfall that I mentioned earlier, Big Bear Falls. Even small children should not have a problem at least making it to this waterfall, as it is only 0.2 miles from the split. This trail does go up and back down one pretty big hill though. Big Bear Falls is only about 30 feet tall, but one thing that is cool about it versus High Shoals Falls is that you can get right up to the bottom of it and even sit in the water if you want to. There are also huge rocks around the falls. Another cool thing about it is there are rocks you can sit on to admire the falls. That is probably my biggest complaint with the rest of the hike, is that there is little to nowhere to sit and look at the other falls. Back at the split, you of course need to go the other way across the wide bridge to continue toward High Shoals Falls. There's a pretty cool spot of the river down to the left of the bridge. The trail continues to be wide and only a little uphill for a bit longer. There's one particular side trail here to the left that offers a nice overlook of the river, especially when the water level is up. I would say the water was at a medium level at the time of this video. The main trail will split twice in a pretty short distance. You'll need to stay to the left at both splits. The second split is where the loop part of the trail actually begins. If you do all the loop, the right side of the second split is where you'll come out. But to be clear, the 2.4 miles does include the part that you have already walked at this point, not just the loop part. After continuing down the left trail for a while, you will come across some slanted rocks. If you look up to the right, you will see a very long slanted rock stretching up the hill. A little bit further down the trail, you will come to a big rocky area. The trail continues over some rocks to the right. There are also some big rocks to the left you can get out onto to get some nice views of the river. You will then come to my favorite thing to see on the hike. It's an area where the trail crosses the river right near a bunch of big rocks that the water is beautifully flowing through. If you want, I think this is a fine place to turn around, since after this point the hike gets significantly more strenuous. The big downside to this spot that I mentioned earlier is how narrow the bridge is. Be prepared to have to squeeze by people. This is another cool spot where my nieces and nephews and I enjoyed playing in the water. The trail continues up the other side of the river. This is a tenth of a mile where it starts to get pretty steep and there are a good number of steps. After climbing the steps, you'll see the bridge that leads to the base of the falls on the right. The viewing platform is pretty spacious and you can usually feel the mist coming off of the falls. The view is pretty cool, but as I mentioned earlier, there is unfortunately nowhere to sit and no permitted way to get into the water. Of course, there will always be people who ignore the signs and go over the rails, but as you can see, it is not the safest thing to do. I just barely caught this clip of this lady slipping and falling right before I stopped my recording. Fortunately, she was fine. Here is where you'll have two decisions to make. The first is whether you want to take the remaining steps to the top of the falls, where you can see two more small waterfalls. The other is how you prefer to descend. You can either turn around and go back down the way you came, or you can choose to finish the loop after hiking to the top of the falls. Each way has its drawbacks. If you go back the way you came, you will of course have to descend all of the steps. And perhaps more importantly, you will have to squeeze past or wait for people who are going up. However, I honestly prefer going back down the steps, because continuing the loop requires you to go uphill for a while longer after reaching the top of the falls, and the descent is fairly steep with almost no steps, which means by the time you reach the bottom, you may feel like your toes are going to go through your shoes. I honestly think it was harder for me going down the hill than it was going up the steps. To get to the top of the falls, you of course go back to the main trail and head up the steps. This section is probably the most strenuous part, but there are thankfully a few spots to stop and sit. When you reach the top of the falls, you will see the other two small waterfalls I mentioned, but it is clear from all the fences and signs that they do not want you to go out onto the falls. There is another bridge that crosses the river to an area that has a bench and a picnic table. If you do choose to finish the loop, you will continue somewhat uphill for 0.4 miles on a wide trail. At this point, the trail heads away from the river, so there's really no other noteworthy things to see. Along the way, you will come across two splits. At each split, you need to stay to the right. It is all downhill after the second split. The trail down is steep enough in some places that you may have to be a little careful not to slip. As I mentioned, there are almost no steps on the way down. After about a half a mile of downhill, you will come back around to where the trail split at the beginning, and you will just head back down the hill to the left back to the parking lot. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing for more informative hiking videos.